So just to recap, we're going to be starting this unit, which is unit 5.9, personal and professional development, and this will sit very nicely with the unit that we just completed, which is people management.
Yeah.
The reason that I say that is because once we've understood that how we work with people, look at teams, coaching, mentoring, training and development, and a bit of things related to human resources and management of human resources, what we now want to be able to concentrate on is how do we look at understanding development at the personal level. That means development at an individual level, and how does learning take place at the individual level when it comes to organizations, when it comes to you working within a setup, business, organization, or a large company. Now here the main objectives of studying this unit would be to try and learn some key things, which is a must, and this is particularly important because this is a topic, PPD as we call it in short, personal and professional development, will be quite pertinent when you study further as well up to the master's level, because there the onus is primarily on the learner to be able to pick up knowledge, to be able to do self-study, and also look at managing the learning at individual level. Now, some of the key things before I go into the details of learning outcome one, but just very briefly, looking at a bit of an overview. Now, this particular unit, will teach you a couple of things that will be helpful going further, maybe professionally in your career as well. Now, one of the things that we will learn in this will be to look at how do we develop, a personal development plan. How do we create a plan, on a personal basis, on a professional basis, to monitor our progress and our development. In short, what I mean by saying that is, when you work within companies, organizations, when you're part of teams, or you're a part of a particular department, there will be a lot of activities that you'll be asked to do or take up in terms of training, which will look at continuously enhancing your skills. And there is a plan that normally within the companies that we are asked to put together, and that plan is called a Career Professional Development Plan, CPD. But when that plan is put together on a self basis, that means on a personal basis, which you share only with yourself, that would be then called as Personal Development Plan. And that PDP at some stage within the organization becomes important, is because most businesses are evolving, situations are evolving, and when you work within an organization, you'll be asked to upskill and do trainings and gain skills, and they'll be based on the gap areas which are picked up, or areas in terms of let's put it this way, development areas which will be picked up, and they will be put together into some sort of a plan on which your training and development will then be mirrored on. And that plan essentially is called the PDP from a personal perspective. But when you look at it, if somebody reviews it rather, and you share that plan with your line manager or somebody senior in the organization, and they monitor and kind of review your progress in terms of the plan, then that will be called a CPD. So I think one of the key takeaways that we will learn from this unit will be how to create a PDP, how to review a PDP, and how to kind of maintain it as a working document. So this will be one of the key things that will come out of this unit. And I think this is something fundamental to working in most organizations going further, and even if you study further at level 6 and 7. The second thing that we will learn in this unit, which is going to be important for us, will be to understand how do we look at doing a SWOT of our own skills and competencies. And in order to do that, what we will look at is learning a technique called skills audit. And this is again going to be relevant because sometimes when you apply for jobs, or when you apply for competency-based positions, when you're given work or assignments which require the usage of your skills, and it is competency-based, you are against the timeline, or you are expected to deliver in terms of the roles and responsibilities assigned, there is always something called a skills audit done. And there are various techniques through which this can be done, but I will share one which will allow us to understand how the skills audit, once done, allows you to populate your SWOT basically help you identify your weaknesses and your threats, and then those are then put together into a PDP for development. So basically, skills audit leads to a SWOT analysis, leads to a personal and professional development plan, which is aligned with the objectives of the organization, so that everybody is working towards to deliver on the overall objectives of the organization. One of the other things that we will also look at in this particular unit will be to understand how do we look at self-managed or managed learning. Now, when I say that, that means that there are lots of things that you will do when you work within an organization. You are expected to be proactive rather than reactive. But when you look at that context, here, one of the key things that we will learn in terms of theoretical framework would be something called the CLOBS learning cycle. And that learning cycle basically helps, for us to understand how does self-managed learning happen. What do you do, or what techniques you use, and what are the situations under which individuals learn themselves or can go into a pattern of learning themselves, managing their learning at the personal level, at the organizational level, at the career level. And last but not the least, this unit, we look at some practical issues or problems in terms of which are normally faced while we are working within the organization. And that is what we will call is something called work-based problems. So sometimes you will see that when you work within organizations, you are given multiple objectives, you have lots of timelines or targets to meet. And sometimes we will get to see that these multiple objectives or the activities which require multitasking will lead to conflict situations, or situations in which you will feel that sometimes you will face problems at work, and how do we resolve these problems. So one of the simplest things which comes across typically in workplaces is the problem of, say, time management, the problem of working within teams, the problem of delegation, or problems with dealing with authority. So in those cases, we will understand practical situations of how to deal with these problems, how to effectively understand to kind of, do away with these problems or find solutions. And to a certain extent, the topic of time management, which is very important, because a lot of us, when we work within organizations, or when we work within different roles, work within a role, we're expected to perform different activities or different roles and responsibilities. And that, to a certain extent, creates issues with regards to time management. So we will understand how you can personally, manage time with the activities which have been given. And sometimes when you agree targets with your line manager, or when you agree on objectives to be fulfilled with your immediate supervisor, how do you work in that situation to kind of agree to what is practically achievable and feasible in the time allocated, and so that you do not take any unrealistic targets, and you're able to kind of deliver with regards to what the organizational objectives are. So as a unit, this is quite important, because it kind of gives you some insight into how organizations work, what is the role of management, and how management and employee negotiation happens around a lot of things. So sometimes it is to do with training and development, sometimes it is to do with taking up competency-based roles, sometimes it is to do with understanding problems that you face at work, and how do you resolve some of these problems, using various techniques that we can that we can look at, considering your skill set, your strengths, and your weaknesses. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, good stuff. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the first learning outcome. Now, in this learning outcome, what we are trying to understand is how does the process of learning happen, and what is the concept of something called self-managed learning, and why is it that it enhances lifelong development. Now, as we have seen over the years, what has happened is that because of the changing lifestyle and the emergence of technology, a lot of data and data, when processed into information, is available, at various steps. Now, because this data, to a certain extent, the raw information or the data, as we call it, is available, and it needs to be processed into information and then information into knowledge. Over the years, a lot of studies done to basically look at how it can enhance, productivity or to a certain extent efficiency. Now, these are the two outputs which the organizations require. But in order to get into this process, is what we need to understand is what is called, self-managed learning. Now, self-managed learning, if you look at as a definition, actually was created by Professor, Ian Cunningham, and he drew this, in terms of the example from looking at doing a lot of studies that he did with his colleague, Klobb, on action learning and the various concepts of how learning can actually happen in the case of individuals when they work within the organization. So very briefly, if I look at explaining this to you in terms of, when we say that learning happens in two ways. There are two elements to learning. One is that the person who's trying to pick up a knowledge or pick up a skill should be in agreement to understand that this is something that needs to be done, and he or she should be willing enough to actually pick that up as a skill or as a function which is required to do the job. The second bit is that the person needs to be put into the right setup, and that setup would mean that the setup actually provides the right set of deliverables, the tools and the techniques for that person to be able to learn either by himself or within the group. Now, this particular structured approach, when both the elements are available and they are conducive, in which the learner is mentally and morally agreed to pick up the skill or to learn, go through the process, and then the right set of deliverables being made available to the individual to be able to pick up or learn either individually or in a group, is basically the process of something called self-managed learning. Now, this was actually picked up in a study that he did, which is where you normally see within a class that there is always an agreement between the students and the teacher. The teacher actually persuades the students to follow certain learning goals. Now, an example here would be that, like, I'm delivering the unit, and you are being receptive here to understand what is being delivered, and you are keen to pick up the knowledge which is being delivered in terms of understanding the concepts and the theoretical frameworks. Now, if you're not in agreement, what that would mean is that even though the delivery is happening, you are not in that position to actually retain that delivery or retain that delivery which is happening to gain that knowledge. So learning in that context cannot happen. So when you look at the concept of learning itself, both the person delivering and the person receiving should be in sync to be able to look at learning happening at any level, whether it's at personal level or it is at at the organizational level. Now, when we look at the concept of self-managed learning, it is also to do with the fact that this is more or less a bit of a holistic approach, because it involves the learner actually proactively engaging to look at self-development, and this is basically supported by some good practices. So over the years, the teachers, for example, the teacher and student relationship, the teachers have picked up the various tools and techniques which are required to make the participation in the class active. Now, if it is a one-way, route, then what you do not get to see is the interaction happening, and where the interaction is not happening, you will not see learning happening. It will be something when there will be a short attention span, and once that attention span actually disappears, you will see that it becomes like a monologue, and that is where the learning actually stops. So when we look at the definition, in essence, it normally is defined as something which is wherein you're looking at a specific learning approach which is derived from elements of several other methods, and it includes self-development, self-learning, and action-based learning. Now, what does that mean? That means that here you will see, if we call the process as self-managed learning, or SML in short, we see that the learner is an active participant in the delivery of that process. You will also see that this learning concentrates on something called, from a learner's perspective, where am I at this moment, where I want to be at some stage after this, the delivery is, happening, and then where do I want to get to? That means with this knowledge and the information that I gain, where can I go to, or gain a position, or gain knowledge to be able to go to a particular level. That has to be answered, and that is what it means by there is a self-development, there is self-learning, and there is a bit of an action. That means you're motivated enough to pick this up as a skill or as an area of knowledge, and then you want to progress from point A to point B. And the reason why this is called holistic approach, as I explained to you earlier, was that this has the conducive elements of both the environment, the learners being participative, and the teacher's delivery being interesting, which makes the whole process of learning happen. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Now, if we look at the process of self-managed learning now, over the years, this is also closely being compared to something called the process of management, because here what they say is, because we're talking about self-managed learning, the focus or the onus is actually on the individual to learn and pick up things which are relevant in terms of skill areas, to be able to pick that up and bring him or her at par with the others in the team. So the onus here, or the focus, essentially is on the learner, because you're put in groups wherein you will normally see that the person who needs to pick up some areas of skills, or needs to pick up new traits, is put in within a group wherein some of the individuals are primarily at a slightly higher level. So the onus does then sit with the person to pick up and then reach a particular level wherein he is then able to interact with the other learners who seem to be a bit more superior in terms of their knowledge and skills. Now, if we understand the concept of self-managed learning, here the key bit is the learning experience needs to be managed, and it needs to be mapped to the requirement of the learner. So in simple essence, what we're looking at is the learning being delivered can be unstructured, but it should allow the freedom in terms of the student to be able to pick the knowledge out, so pick the things out which are relevant to him or her for to cover. So here what we do get to see is that if you look at the sessions that we are doing, we normally tend to do a student-learner agreement or a teacher-learner agreement. The idea is that you need to be in sync with the sessions and the delivery which is happening, because this is being done for your benefit. So there is a teacher-learner agreement in the place that you are attending sessions, and you're going through this the learning outcomes and the overview to gain the knowledge, and that knowledge effectively then translates into when you do something in terms of the assessment or assignments. So here the choice is with the learner, and the choice which is there with the learner has to be from a point of view of a commitment, not just a choice, but has to link into a commitment wherein you are taking out the time to be able to put this into practice in terms of join the sessions, pick the key things or takeaways from the session, and then go back and do a bit of self-study to crystallize the thought. And that is where the self-learning process, as a self-learning process begins to work. Now, one of the other things that we look at in this process, which is important, is that reflections or feedback is important, because you see the whole process wherein the delivery happens. Towards the end of the month, we take some feedback from the learner in terms of how the sessions are they interactive enough, are they having sufficient knowledge through which you are able to pick up things? Are they relevant to the learning outcomes? So these are areas that we take a feedback on, because it is a corrective process at both ends, not just the teacher, but also at the student's end. So here, it can only work, when I say self-managed learning as a process can only work, there is no such specific formula, but it can only work if there is participation from both sides. And both sides, when I say both sides, means teacher and the student, or the teacher and the learner, they feel that they are gaining something from this process in terms of delivery and in terms of receiving the delivery. So when we look at this, it is a combination of two things. One, the delivery which is happening from the tutor. But on the other hand, it is something which is to do with the work and the experience that you have as a learner to be able to get hold of that delivery. So as an example, a simple example that I would do is to explain this is, sometimes what happens is when we are working within a you're working within an organization, what tends to happen is your manager would call you, and what he or she would say is that, okay, can we get this work done? Now, what tends to happen is when he gives the work, basically, there are two ways in which that can be given. One is you look at basically segmenting or dividing the work so that every individual has a role to play. And the other would be the manager basically calls in a meeting and then he says, okay, this is what the task I'm looking at accomplishing. Can you as a team work on this and deliver the task? So in that case, what tends to happen is the team would sit down and they would then have a discussion amongst themselves. And there they would, depending on the skill areas, their strengths, their weaknesses, their ability to be able to contribute, each of the individual members will pick up a task, and that task will become critical in order for the overall objective to be achieved. So everybody will have to contribute, and the contribution in that case would be, if I specify this clearly, would be every worker will pick up that area of work which he or she feels is something that she knows quite well. So example, if you've been given a task to make a presentation and you are 2 or 3 of you together to be able to draft this presentation, what will happen is there's a discussion which will happen, and one of them would say, maybe 1 or 2 will say that, okay, I'm good with the PowerPoint software, so I would be able to finish and polish the presentation, format it, and present it in a very good style. One of you could basically say that, okay, I'm good with this data and I can do a bit of research, and that I can put it across into the slides, which then can be formatted to finish the presentation. And the third person might say, okay, what I can do in this case would be, my strength areas lies in communication, and I would be able to kind of present this to a relevant audience, and that would help in my contribution. So what you've seen in this case is that in the case of self-managed learning, most of these workers would have picked up on the area of strengths which they feel they have knowledge on and the skills on, and then they decide that this is how the work needs to be divided, and their contributions are accordingly reflected in the work they do. But because they picked up their own areas without any compulsion to do something else, but the areas which are skill areas or strength areas with them, and has allowed them to kind of bring this activity to a close, you will call this process as more or less a process of self-paced learning or self-managed learning, because they are looking at building on their areas of strength, and these areas of strength or something that they have done previously in terms of experience has been utilized to complete that job. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is the example, are you okay with the example? Were you able to understand that?
Yeah, I was.
Okay, good stuff. Now, what I want to do is, along with that, let's look at one of the other key things in terms of when we say, self-managed learning. Now, what are the things which are involved in, learning? So some of the key things that we look at, just to look at key terms, something that we look at are learning styles. Now you know that everybody does not have the same ability to learn in the same way, and everybody is different. So some of us understand maybe visual science, some of us understand audio science, some of us are more with audio visual, and some of us also use body language or our movement of hands, which is kinesthetic, and that is what we use to express when we are learning. Correct? So here, when we look at the concept of self-paced, self-managed learning, we look at also understanding what are different learning styles, and that we'll get into. What are the approach which individuals can take when they want to learn something? So some of us are, it'll be fair to say that sometimes when we look at the concept of approaches, we do see that we talk about proactive, reactive, we talk about, some of the other approaches that I will explain. But here the main meaning of approaches is that there are various ways in which something can be done or can be accomplished, and everybody would have a different approach. So the idea here would be, if you are asked to learn something or pick up a skill area, like somebody wants to learn something in terms of, say, a musical instrument, some of them want to maybe pick up a sport, but the idea is they are taking different approaches to go to a particular goal, and that could be, something that we need to know. Now, learning, how does learning become effective? Sometimes you're in the class and you get to hear your teacher say you're physically here, you're mentally somewhere else. So in order to make the learning effective, what are the various elements which are required? So when I say effective learning, sometimes teachers you will see use audio visuals, look using a video, they might do some group discussions, they will ask you to do a bit of brainstorming, they might give you an activity, and the idea of having to do that is to make learning effective. And this is what we'll also look at. Now, how does learning become lifelong? Sometimes you look at hearing this sentence, or people make this statement saying that, I've been learning this for a number of years, and I've perfected this over a number of years of, learning, or over number of years of training. So we look at the concept of why lifelong learning is important, because organizations which grow, they focus on training and development, and they always want their staff, employees, whatever you call them, staff or employees, workers, they want them to keep learning. And learning means if you're keeping on learning, then you are being innovative as an organization. And then to a certain extent, lots of trainings happening, a lot of learning that you do. How do we see that the learning is basically assessed? That learning is actually making a difference. And those are the things that we will look at when we look at these key concepts. So let's briefly look at, very briefly look at this concept of, self-managed learning. Now, what is learning? Learning is a process. And sometimes what you have to do is, when you're learning things, you have to set a very clear goal. You have to have the aims and requirements. That means if you're doing this particular course, which is the Health and Social Care Management course at level 5, there must be a goal that you have in mind, and that is why you're doing this course, isn't it? Yeah. So in order for you to kind of take this decision that I want to learn, you must have looked at some of the end results or objectives of this qualification. And that is what is called clear goal setting. So if you've started this as a process and you have taken the initiative to get onto this course and learn, it is quite clear that you're looking at managing your learning, and you also have some clear end objectives that you want to achieve after completing this course. The other points should fall into place in the sense is you have a little bit of an orientation to achieve the goal. That means you're kind of motivated, you have kept aside some resources, timing, you've looked at some allocation of timing, and the reason why you've done that is because you want to be able to successfully complete this course. And then you put some targets in terms of dates of achievement, that okay, if I do this in this time, then I can achieve this particular outcome. If I overall continue with this timeline, I should be able to complete the course in such and such duration. And then towards the end of it, when you submit an assignment, or when you are actually completing a particular unit and you send some piece of work, that is nothing but a bit of a reflection in terms of what you've learned from those sessions, or what you've learned from that unit. Will it be safe to say that?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. And then let's look at learning styles. Now, there are different learning styles which Klopp, as a as a scientist, or as a person who did a lot of studies in the case of learning and teaching, did. And in the 1980s, he came across with something called the Klopp cycle. And this CLOP cycle basically talked about, things which came across with something called the learning styles. Now, David Klopp actually, the background is that obviously he did a bit of research on how learning happens, and he looked at coming out with a couple of concepts which talked about that, sometimes learning happens because you've had this experience in the past, and that he called experiential learning. And that theory which he created came across with different types of style in terms of why and when, how and where this learning actually happens. So what we will do is, when we look at the learning styles, we will look at this particular theory to understand and crystallize our understanding of learning styles. Now, there are various learning styles. Now, in terms of learning styles, we classify them as personal preferences. The reason we say that is, you will see that there are different characteristics and traits which every individual has, and depending on that, their learning style would vary. So let's look at these 4 learning styles. Now, what is an activist? The activist is when he did this experimentation and he studied a lot of learners and how they learn, whether it's from experience or doing things, whether it is observing things, whether it is learning from somebody else's experience, or it is in the sense they want to thoroughly plan out and decide to learn. So the 4 styles is where he classified them as activist, pragmatist, reflectist, and so there were 4, and theorist. So this is what we will define in terms of the CLOB's learning cycle. So the activist is one wherein the person actually immerses himself fully into getting the new experience. Sometimes you get to hear a word that, people are quite enthusiastic when they are given a responsibility. When it comes to volunteering or taking up a particular job, they are quite flexible and forthcoming to be volunteers. So you will see these kind of individuals which believe in acting, they believe in taking actions, they are quite generally enthusiastic, passionate about trying out new things, and they normally tend to kind of, immerse themselves in the things that they are trying, something new, right?
Yeah.
And these people are classified on the basis of the traits they show as activist. Okay, this is one type. The second type that we look at is something called pragmatist. Now, these people essentially meticulously plan before they act on anything. So here they are keen to try new ideas, but what they want to be able to do is, before they try them out, they want to kind of thoroughly understand what are the ins and outs of it, the benefits or advantages of it, and they basically take a cautious approach to trying out something new. They're willing to try, they want to try, but before they take that approach of trying something new, what they do is they're cautious, they want to know ins and out about it, and they want to make sure that when they commit to something, when they get into something, this is something which is they are interested in doing, or they are going to take it to completion. Okay. The third type that he discovered, because of the experience people have, and when they look at learning, they look at being classified as something called theorists. Now, they typically are the ones which look at a lot of things from a logical point of view rather than a rational point of view. So their objective is to basically look at problems through logical manner. They look at bringing in rationality and objectivity. That means if you look at example that I will give you here will be, if say you have a group of individuals within a team, and one of the individuals, say one of the persons within the team has been given the responsibility to say plan something or manage a party. Now, what they would look at doing is they would take that approach of being logical and rational to find out what dates are suitable with everyone, what is the preference in terms of menu or eating, in terms of habits. They will also look at what are the objectives of doing this event. And here they will plan it out in such a way that they come out with, a date or an event which is suitable for most of the people. So they try to look at things from a point of view of, looking at logical conclusions. That means it should lead to something. And they are quite disciplined. And they also have, the basic assumptions of understanding how to put together a particular event. Or if sometimes you will see in the team, if you are asked to volunteer and there is a new type of a job which needs to be done, these people will be people who are basically in that position wherein they are able to assume, things, and they are clear about how things work. And when they look at putting together something, they are in a position to essentially understand how these things will work perfectly well. Now, the fourth type is reflector. These people are keen on, they kind of take a step back position. That means they'll normally say, okay, let him try out first, and then we'll observe and see the outcome, and then I will try it. So they kind of tend to sit back and relax and observe things, how it happens. They take a bit of a back seat, as we call them, and then what they try and do is they try and observe people first, see what is the outcome being, they analyze it, and then what they, if they decide to do, then they will try and see how we can course correct some of the mistakes or gap areas to be able to do it well than the ones which have done it before. So these kind of people would be grouped into a category called reflector. Now, when we look at these four different types of learning styles, Klobb, what he did was he created a Klobb's, a learning style model, which is called the Experiential Learning Theory Model, ELT. And in this, he classified them according to, something called 4 stages. And here, these 4 stages, this is theoretical, you have to understand this. These 4 stages are listed here. So it talks about concrete experience, reflective observation. It talks about, abstract conceptualization and active experimentation. Now, somebody who looks at these 4 stages, let's look at it very briefly. That they are, plotted out on a quadrant, wherein I'll give you a bit of a paper to understand them as a theoretical concept. So it is like a quadrant which can be plotted out, and each of these are 4 different corners of that quadrant. And you could sometimes have, kind of diverging, personalities. So people could be, having concrete, experience, but also be leaning towards reflective observation. Some of them could be keen on gaining information, which is assimilating, but also could be, looking at reflective observation. So what we are trying to do here is, in this, 4 types of learning styles, he came up with a concept of a matrix. And in that matrix, what he said was, depending on where the individual is actually placed in this 4-stage learning cycle, their experiences tend to be of a certain type. And these certain type are based on something called diverging, assimilating, converging, and accommodating. And this is where the quadrant ratio actually works. And this is what is shown here, just as an example. So if I have to say that who are people who have concrete experience, that means these are people who will basically look at new experiences, want to try out a situation, and they are more keen in terms of being enthusiastic to try something new. And the 4 types, he merged with the 4 types of learning. So 4 types of learning styles were merged with 4 types of learning process. And these were that if you do learning mostly through experience, then you are basically on the concrete experience side. If you do learning mostly through watching or observation, then you are on the reflective observation side. If you do most of the learning through thinking, or basically looking at theoretical models and studying what is available in terms of published articles or research which is there, then you are more of a thinking type. But if you believe in doing things and then learning, sometimes people would say a simple example would be a fire cannot burn anything, but they put their hand on it and they learn that okay, because they put the hand on the fire, it burns their hand. But they've done the experience by actively doing it and then understanding that okay, this is the consequence if you put your hand over fire. So these 4 types were merged with the 4 types of learning styles. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So is that clear? So this is one of the most important, theoretical frameworks that we learn from, when we try and classify people in terms of the learning types and also the situations in which they will learn or how do they learn. So the idea of Klopp's study was to understand how people learn, and then he tried to define the types in terms of the different types of learning which can happen. So 4 different types of learning with 4 different types of situations plotted onto a particular quadrant, which allowed him to understand that okay, the learning in this case happens because they are more keen on actively doing things, and if they are more closer to, say for example, this side, then they could be either pragmatist or they could also be activist, depending on where they are placed in this quadrant. Okay, so if somebody is placed here, then is, say for example, if I bring this, if I say somebody is placed here, if somebody is placed here, what you will see is that person is more of a abstract thinker, but at the same point in time, the person is also could be a person who believes on learning by doing things. Somebody who's placed here might be more towards somebody who thinks of doing things, but also places an emphasis on after doing, he wants to experience what he has learned. So this particular quadrant, allows you to plot the 4 learning styles into the 4, what do you call, the 4 learning styles in accordance with what is called the 4 different areas in which people can learn, or situations under which people can learn. So he classified the 4 types here, which is activist, reflectist, pragmatist, and theorist. But in terms of what is important for them from the activity, some of them look at watching and learning, some of them look at thinking and learning, some of them reading, thinking and learning, some of them believe in doing, and some of them actually want to experience it and learn. So he plotted these 4 with the 4 types of learning styles, and that is what is essentially called the Klopp's experiential learning cycle. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, assuming sometimes you're, if you're working as, say, for example, as a manager within the organization, and you manage a lot of resources, what you try and do is you try and do a fitment with the type of colleagues or employees that you work with, that what kind of an employee or a person he is, or a colleague is he. What you will do is you look at the type of styles which the person shows in terms of learning, participating in activities, along with the characteristic the person has. Is he a person who's risk-taking? Is he a person who believes in calculating, planning, and then acting? Is he a person who looks at doing things, or is he a person who takes a back seat, observes, and then decides to participate? So if you know those qualities, you can map them across into the 4 different types of learnings that they can take, and that helps you to understand colleagues or people when you give them jobs or roles and responsibilities within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
So this particular concept or the theoretical framework is important because when we talk about learning, there are different styles of learning and there are different ways in which people learn. And this particular model of David Klopp, which is the learning style model, came across with this particular concept. And that is why it is important when we look at self-managed learning or learning within organizations. Now, part of this that we've looked at, there are different ways to learn. So coaching and mentoring, we are aware, we have covered this in the previous unit, right? So sometimes when you look at the approaches to learn, if you are given a task, for example, just as an example, like I've given a task in the office to a lot of my staff, is that can you look at bringing yourself up to date with social media? When I say social media could also mean Facebook, Twitter, it could mean, LinkedIn, a lot of other activities. But because I've said social media, there are lots of ways the staff could learn. One is they could do their own research in terms of finding out how Facebook works, Twitter works, how the AdWords work on that. And sometimes what they do is they also interact with others to share some ideas. Okay, this is what I do. I post, every day on Facebook, or I put out a tweet every, 4 hours, and they're learning from each other. Some of them would, if they have no experience about social media, they would want to go in, immerse themselves, maybe open a Facebook account, and see how social networking works. Correct?
Yeah.
In some cases, you will see people will actually want to learn or maybe get a bit of a spoon feeding, and that is where the concept of coaching and mentoring will come. They'll say, okay, you've been on Facebook for a number of years. Can you share some of the best practices? What are the things to do, not to do? How do I get on it? Because this is something new to me. So what you're doing in that field is you're basically asking somebody to coach you. And the mentoring would be that same exercise, but that's happening over a longer period of time. So these are various ways in which people can learn. The other ways could be you're asked to attend a seminar, you go and attend a training, you maybe participate in a conference. Sometimes you go in for a job interview, you also learn a lot of things during the job interview because you're asked a number of questions, and some of these questions you have not anticipated. So sometimes you end up learning even in the interviews. You use the internet to learn. That means you're using, say, for example, to do a bit of research about something like a definition of a particular word. If you have to do, you go onto the internet, launch the browser, and you do a definition of that. You try and find that word, look at the definition. Sometimes you also do learning within social networks, and you go on to company intranets. Sometimes you will see that companies have a lot of policies and procedures which are created on the intranet which employees can access. And these are all ways through which learning can happen. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now, some of the other slides that we would look at today would be when we know there are lots of approaches to study, lots of approaches to learn. We know there are different styles in which people learn. And we also know that there are different phases of learning which are typically classed across the 4-stage clubs cycle. So the way people want to learn. Now, what we want to be able to do is relate that to something called effective learning. How do we ensure that whatever we pick up as knowledge, as skill, as something which is information or data is something which is going to be useful for us in the future? What do you mean by effective learning? Something which you pick up and you find it useful for future usage or in the future. So one of the key things that we look at is when we look at effective learning, we look at what are the skills that you've been able to pick out or get from what you've attended as a course, for example. Now, sometimes you will see within the organization, your manager would say, okay, you need a bit of training on, say, telephone etiquette. So why don't you go and attend a half-a-day course on this, which is sponsored by the company? Sometimes you will see your manager would say, okay, you're good in, verbal communication, but I would recommend that you go and do a bit of a session or a course on written communication. It could be because in the organization, they write a lot of formal communication, which goes out on email, letters, or things like that. And he or she feels that you have the potential, but you need to kind of sharpen up some of these skills to understand how letters are written professionally, or, some of these communication techniques would involve written communication and how you could perfect that through a half-a-day training program or a one-day training program. Sometimes you will see your managers would say that you're very good at everything. All you need to do is do a bit of better planning. That means they ask you to do a bit of task list. They ask you to write down things that you're doing, or ask you to look at things from a point of view of proper planning when you get into something. Organization is something at a bigger scale. So planning at a smaller scale on a personal level. Organization, when you're managing something for a number of people, you're looking at putting in the organization in place. And at some stage, you will see all managers will do a bit of evaluation. That means they will review to see if this is having a change or if this is having an effect. A simple example that I would give you on that side would be at the end of the month, your manager would say that, okay, I've given you a few tasks. Can we review what have you achieved? What have you accomplished? Or what have you been able to complete and deliver? And that process would be nothing but the process of evaluation. Now, in that process, the manager would sit down with you and maybe understand things which were working well, things which were not working well, which could be in terms of time that you had to be able to do the task, or some of the tasks in which the delivery was completed but was compromised in terms of quality. So there is a lot of evaluation being done to try and not have these same mistakes or gap areas repeated. And that is where a structured process of evaluation looks at reviewing things, that whether this has been effective or not, or ineffective. Sometimes you also see that in the organization, what happens is there are lots of trainings which people are sent on, and what they're asked to do is, after the training has happened, they're asked to do a test. And the test is done because the trainer wants to ensure or find out how much have you gained in that training session during the course of the day. Isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Sometimes if you get a speeding ticket and you opt in for, instead of the fine, you opt in for the training session, you go there for 4 to 5 hours training session. Towards the end of the training session, the trainer there gives you a test. And the reason why the trainer has given you a test or is asking you to take that test and you have to pass is because he wants to ensure, he or she wants to ensure that whatever has been discussed, delivered on that day, it has had an impact. It has had, the desired impact, which then allows you to not to make that mistake again. And that is where they put you to a test. And the test is done to kind of evaluate how successful the training has been and what you've been able to retain during the course of the training. Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So that is how, sometimes in the organization, when we have to find out whether the learning as an exercise is being effective or not, training and development is being effective or not, is done through the point of view of evaluation. And this evaluation can be done in different ways. So sometimes you have appraisals, that is an evaluation for the year as an employee. Sometimes you have you have short meetings that happen during the course of the week, monthly basis, and those meetings are done primarily to find out if these are, if they are keeping a check on your progress and are you able to deliver, or if you need additional resources. And that process typically talks about something called evaluation. Now, one or two last slides that we want to look at is just to understand and round this topic up. When you say learning, now learning could be short-term, learning could be long-term, and when the learning happens throughout the course of your life, then it is called lifelong learning, as simple as that, right? Yeah. Now, sometimes you get to hear that statement is that, we learn new things every day, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So when we say you learn new things, you learn new things every day, is because human beings as individuals do lifelong learning. So you can keep on improving, you can keep on learning new things. And sometimes this lifelong learning needs to be initiated. It does not necessarily happen on its own. So there are different tools and techniques that we are going to look at. PDP is one of them, CPD or PDP is one of them, which then looks at initiating this process of learning happening throughout the life of a particular individual. So you will see a lot of people pick up the habit of reading books or engaging themselves in terms of doing a bit of learning themselves, and that is proactive. So that is self-directed learning. They don't need to be told what they need to do. And sometimes what you will see is individuals, when they move through their career roles, what they will see is they know exactly what trainings they need to do because they are more self-conscious, they're more aware, and they are more of an activist or pragmatist, because they know that this is the benefit and advantages of doing the right training at the right time, which keeps them moving up in the career. Now, there are other forms that we will discuss in the second and third learning outcome. One is CPD and PPD, which is Personal Development Plan and Career Continuous Professional Development Plan. There are other areas that you can look at. Sometimes you go on a lot of trainings, apprenticeships, and you also hear a concept called recognition to prior learning.
Yep.
These are various concepts that you look at when you talk about learning, right? Sometimes you will see that your employers will put you through a training process. Sometimes you will see, employers putting you through apprenticeships, because there are new skill sets which need to be acquired, and what they do is they want you to do on-job training, and that will happen in the route of apprenticeships. sometimes you will see a lot of people who have a lot of years of experience want to gain, say, maybe a qualification or say a particular skill, and that in terms of acquiring, they have a short route to acquiring that skill because they seem to be having a lot of experience which would be relevant to that field. And in that case, there's a process called RPL, recognition to prior learning, which will be applied to say that, okay, you can get an exemption here, exemption here, exemption here, because you have experience in that field or in that location or in that sector already. And because you have the relevant knowledge, that would mean that you'll be exempt on doing those modules. And in those cases, we will allow that individual to progress to the next level or to the next level of training by using a process called recognition to prior learning, because they have a number of years of experience, they're a veteran, they have previously attended a course of a similar nature, and there is no point in them going through the same course again, which will then be a bit more repetitive. But in this case, what we do is we apply the process of RPL to be able to give them the credit of saying that, okay, they have the experience in this particular field because of their prior experience. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
And last but not the least, when we look at evaluation, so sometimes you will see assessment of learning, and this I'll directly correlate to the fact that as a learner, as a student on this course, we do the assessment of your learning through which document?
Sorry?
Now, as a learner in this particular course,
Yeah.
and as a teacher, which document that we use to assess your learning? How do we do your assessment
Through
at
our
the end of the unit or the module?
yeah, through our assignment.
Through your assignment, absolutely correct. So the assessment of learning can also be done through various ways. Now, the reason why assessment of learning in this case is done because you're looking at achieving a qualification, and when you submit an assignment, we assess that against the standards set by ATHE and of call, and see that if your learning demonstrates, these particular criteria as is required, then you are able to achieve that module, that unit, and that qualification.
Yeah.
But in general, when we look at assessment of learning, the reason why we want to do assessment is to be continuously able to gauge that the learning is happening at the individual level, right? If there is no benchmark, if there is no reference or no scale, then we do not know that whether this is leading to improvement or not, right? So sometimes this is maybe a slightly different example, but in the case of healthcare, for example, if somebody has had an accident or something, and they've been asked to undergo physiotherapy sessions, you attend a lot of physiotherapy sessions. At every session that you do, the improvement that you're having, maybe in the movement, is being assessed by your physiotherapist by asking you to do certain tasks or activities. So it could be said to do with walking, or say, for example, straightening a leg or whatever. But in that case, every session when you come in and attend, he basically looks at what you've achieved in the last session by asking you to do a task and activity. And this is because he is setting an incremental target for you to be able to improve further from there. And that can only happen if he assesses you at that present position and then sets a realistic target, which is a smart target for you to be able to go from stage A to B. And because you go from A to B, this requires a bit of assessment to say, okay, you were here, you're not able to move, or because after the accident you were totally, not able to move or walk. But now, because of these sessions, these exercises that you're doing, you're able to improve, your mobility is improved, and you're able to walk without, say, the crutches. And that is where the assessment of learning is happening, because you're moving the patient from point A to point B, and that means you're moving them from a target set, and then you assess whether the person has achieved that particular target or not. Okay. Now, evidence at all levels is required. So sometimes this is documented. In your case, when you submit the assignment, we mark it, assess it, and this is documented because we want to recognize what evidence has been picked to say that this is showing an achievement or this is showing an improvement. Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And in some cases, if we do find that you are still not meeting the criteria, then we give you a bit of feedback saying that, okay, can you try this approach? Can you look at this particular approach? Can you do this here on this side? And that then tends to move by moving your goalpost and giving you a bit of feedback to say that, okay, you have to look at things from this way. And that helps you achieve maybe the task. So sometimes you will see that the assessment of learning is done through looking at improved ability in terms of, personal learning. It could be in the form of evidence that we look at how you move from point A to B. And sometimes it is from a point of view of feedback. And sometimes it is to recognize achievements, right? So if in a batch there are 10 students and one of them has achieved distinction, the others have achieved, say, pass, then what we are going to do is recognize the achievement. But from that achievement, we will clearly pick out areas which will show to the other learners that why the person has achieved distinction and where are the gap areas. You could have also achieved that score, but here are these gap areas which you've not been able to cover, and that is why your result has been passed, whereas the other person's result has been, say, a higher score. So achievements can also be looked at setting a benchmark to do the assessment of learning. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
So I think this kind of rounds up our first learning outcome to understand how learning happens, how learning can be managed at the individual level, what are the various ways in which learning happens at the individual level, the learning styles, which is what we study through the club's learning cycle, and then how these learnings can kind of impact the assessment of individuals working within the organization and what are the benefits they can get. So it definitely leads to improvement in terms of, skills or knowledge or gaining information. But the assessment part of it allows us to clearly measure which approach has worked, how it has worked, and has that been effective or has that been ineffective. Okay?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. I'm going to send you the copy of the slides and also send you a bit of a handout for you to be able to read for learning outcome 1. And that will concentrate on making you understand what are the various approaches through which we can do self-managed learning, which are these approaches. So sometimes you will see that people are able to learn on their own, at their own pace. They can pick up the book and learn. Some of us need to be, shown how to do it, and then we pick it up. So those styles, the approaches have to be learned, and the other is the club's learning style cycle has to be understood, so that sometimes when you have to give certain things to colleagues, individual peers, members within a team, you have to tailor the information in such a way that it is suitable according to their style for them to be able to pick up in order for the learning to happen. Okay. And the last bit would briefly concentrate on something called the benefits of learning in terms of when we look at how learning happens and why is it beneficial to the learner and the organization. Okay, so these are two presentations which basically focus on one, the theoretical part, which is this one that I went through, and the other bit was to make you understand the club's learning cycle and the learning styles, which are important for us to be able to apply the theoretical concepts here. Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions on this so far, Sadia?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. So let me send this across to you after the session, and we'll catch up, later this week for the research, which will be done by my colleague Anju.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Send out some invites for this unit in order for us to be able to cover it just, hopefully just before the Easter break.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm still working on my previous assignment. I'm almost done on it. Just
Sure.
It's just finding the time to sit down and do it sometimes for me.
No, that's fine. As long as my suggestion is, because we're going to be trying to finish this unit before Easter, if between this week and mid of next week, if you can send that over, then I can provide you some feedback so that if there are any changes which need to be done, you can actually do them over the Easter break along with finishing up this assignment as well.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, I will do. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for joining the session today, and I'll catch up with you next week.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.